Hi, my name is Sarah Perry and I've been nominated from the 2010 Top Energy Far North Science and Technology Fair for my scientific investigation on how temperature affects the quality of the Pacific oyster. The Pacific oyster, Cassostrias gigas, was accidentally introduced to New Zealand from the Pacific coast of Asia in the mid-1970s. It was grown and the oyster farmers saw that it grew faster and more reliably than the native New Zealand rock oyster, Cassostrias commercialis, and soon became the main raised oyster in New Zealand. Living in the Bay of Islands, we are surrounded by many shellfish, and I wanted to do a unique experiment that I would enjoy. I had a contact for the Kaio Sanford oyster plant, and after a meeting with them, we discovered that there was an area in the oyster chilling that could be looked into further that would produce scientific data and would be of interest to the company. Last year, New Zealand exported $1.35 billion worth of seafood globally, with the Pacific oyster being one of the main aquaculture products we export. Food and health safety problems are associated with the oyster, and many countries have regulations that control where and how these oysters can be harvested. In New Zealand, this is done by NZFSA, New Zealand Food Safety Authority. Before reaching the consumer, oysters undergo a series of handling and rehandling. This process, whilst preserving them, is potentially harming the oyster's health and deteriorating its quality, thus exposing the consumer to a less than perfect product. The purpose of this experiment is to find an optimum temperature which is more beneficial to the oyster, the producer and the consumer, whilst meeting current NZFSA regulations regarding acceptable bacterial limits. The aim of Experiment 1 was to find a temperature that kept bacterial growth on the oysters to an acceptable level, as enforced by NZFSA, and to see the maximum amount of days oysters can be chilled. 120 Pacific oysters were harvested from Orangatani Sanford Farm. Oysters were stored at 5, 6, 8 or 9 degrees for a total of 12 days. Samples of 2 oysters from each different chilled temperature were removed every day of experimentation. I had hoped to swab plates every 2 days, but due to the result of the fire, this was not possible. After removal from the chilled environment, both a makonki and a nutrient agar plate were inoculated for each different temperatures. The 8 plates were stored in the incubator for 2 days. After the incubation of the plates, observations and plate counts were conducted. For Experiment 2, Sanford provided me with 140 Pacific oysters from one of their farms. The oysters were left for a total of 12 days at 7 degrees, the regulated temperature for storing all BMS, and samples of 20 oysters were weighed, shucked, with observations being made and dehydrated every 2 days. After dehydration, the fluid loss was calculated. The purpose of this experiment was to see how the current NZFSA rule of refrigerating oysters at 7 degrees affects the quality of oysters in storage, and to see how long they can be chilled before deterioration makes the oyster non-consumable. In Experiment 1 and 2, I have used a trend line to determine the long-term effect, and have used R-squared values to talk about the relationship of the data with the trend. I have also calculated 95% confidence intervals on Excel for the average final plate counts for both makonki and nutrient agar. These intervals show that if the experiment was to be repeated many times, the average number of colonies or coliforms would fall within this range. If the error bars overlapped, it showed that the temperature had no significant difference in restricting growth, and we can assume that the average number of colonies or coliforms recorded could be similar if not the same. Where they didn't, it implies that there was a significant difference between the average number of bacteria, and so the confidence intervals clearly showed which temperature were the best at inhibiting growth. So far, my findings have shown the oyster, the producer and the consumer could quite markedly benefit from a slight alteration in the handling of the Pacific oyster, which could, if researched further, see a revision in the NZFSA regulation for bivalve muscular shellfish. I have found that oysters can be stored at 8 degrees or below. This supports the NZFSA regulation for BMS to be stored at 7 degrees. I have discovered that oysters should be removed from refrigeration at ideally 5 days, but no later than 7, as at this point the oyster's health begins to deteriorate and the bacterial colonies are further adding to the deterioration of the product, making it non-consumable. When going back to Sanford's, there was a definite positive response. They say that confirms what the industry suspects already. Chilling time has to be as short as possible. This is something as food processors we have in mind. The question of implementing further regulations, however, remain open. Thank you.